While the trade deadline did have a few fireworks, from a fantasy perspective, there was nothing huge, but there were a couple of wide receivers on the move, and because of that, it's going to change the outlook for some of these guys and some of these teams moving forward. And the first team that was affected is the first team that we're going to talk about on Thursday Night Football, with Las Vegas and Denver facing off. Jakobi Meyers' trade to the Jacksonville Jags is going to open up some opportunities for Trey Tucker to build on some of the positives that we've seen from him so far this season. No, he hasn't been fantasy reliable, and he's not a guy that I'm even jumping to start this week with a tough matchup going up against Denver, who allows the third fewest fantasy points per game. But as the season goes on and he gets some better matchups, if he truly is the wide receiver 1 and the number 2 target behind Brock Bowers, he could have some fantasy value. With it being a tougher matchup, Thursday Night Football, and Jakobi Meyers being traded, and wondering how exactly this is going to work out, I would probably stay away from all these wide receivers. We'll monitor Tyler Lockett and Jack Beck and see where they end up over the next couple of weeks, and if their roles grow. Courtland Sutton didn't have a big week last week. He only had 1 catch, but he made it count for a touchdown. And this week, going up against Las Vegas, allowing the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers, we're going to go ahead and toss in Courtland Sutton as a start this week. And if you're looking for a fringe start, it would be Troy Franklin. He had a solid week last week. 10 targets with no Marvin Mims, and Marvin Mims has returned to practice in a limited capacity as of this recording, but he will still be questionable for this weekend. For Atlanta and Indianapolis, they made one of the biggest deals of the trade deadline, pushing all the chips in as the Irsay women under new leadership said, hey, we want to give Indianapolis a championship team once again. They've been doing a great job since stepping in for their father after his passing, so kudos to them for making a deal of this magnitude in their first year. And I got a ton of questions about how does this affect Drake London. I don't think Sauce Gardner is going to be that big of an impact on Drake London this week. You got to keep in mind for Sauce, it's a new team, a new defensive system. It's a short week since he was traded on Tuesday. And on top of that, he's got to go to Berlin for this game this week. It's going to be a little bit of a different week, and it's going to be a lot on Gardner to take in right away. So I highly doubt he's going to shadow Drake London the entire game. In fact, I wouldn't be shocked if Gardner works on and off the field a little bit as well. Prior to bringing in Gardner, Indianapolis was still allowing the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Drake London over the last 3 weeks has had a wide receiver 1 and a wide receiver 2 performance, and he has 40 targets in 3 games since their bye week. Adonai Mitchell was not doing very much for Indianapolis anyway, so his trade doesn't really impact this team all that much, except for the fact that I do think it establishes the fact that Pittman, Downs, and Pierce are going to be the guys in this offense for a while now moving forward, and I think it's exceptionally good for Alec Pierce. As long as he's healthy, he's going to have a big role as the deep threat for this team. Now, it's not a great matchup this week. Atlanta is allowing the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And for Michael Pittman, he is going to be a start for me this week. He's playing exceptionally well right now. Pittman is the safest option, and he's the must-start of this group. He has back-to-back top 12 performances at the wide receiver position, and he has 7 wide receiver 2 performances on the year. He's been steady with a little bit of upside. When you take a look at what Alec Pierce has done, he has at least 10 targets and 90 receiving yards in 2 of his last 3 games. Josh Downs has a touchdown in each of his last 3 games. Pierce and Downs, they have some fantasy value, but they are more along the lines of dart throws. Guys that we might look to put in our lineup if we're dealing with injuries or buys. Downs and Pierce are not safe plays, but they do present some upside if Pierce can get some big plays and Downs can score a touchdown. The New York Giants and the Chicago Bears are going to get one of those matchups that I think will make fantasy owners happy this week. The New York Giants have not been solid on defense this year, and Chicago just got out of a massive shootout with Cincinnati where it was whoever scores last will end up being the winner. The Chicago Bears are now allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. It's a great matchup for Wan'Dale Robinson as a safe play. Last week, he had 11 targets and he caught 9 of them. And he has at least 7 targets in 4 of his last 5 games. Again, there is a solid floor when it comes to Wan'Dale Robinson, with a little bit of upside because this is a solid matchup. Darius Slayton, he has been inconsistent. He had a drop touchdown last week, but he still saw 7 targets and he caught 5 of them for 62 yards. So again, another dart throw. If you're looking for like a big play upside type of guy, then you might be able to get Darius Slayton. The Giants are allowing the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and DJ Moore has his 2 best games of the season in back-to-back weeks so far. And you might be a little confused and you might be thinking, Kyle, Rome Odunze has 1 good week in his last 4 games. And I get it. And he's not nearly as good as he looked to begin the season, but I do expect him to get back on track. And this is such a good matchup. It's really hard not to roll with him after only getting 3 targets last week. I would assume that Ben Johnson and Caleb Williams will make it a point to ensure Rome Odunze has a much bigger impact this week. With as well as DJ Moore is playing, we're going to put him back in the lineup. He's looked really good with 70 or more receiving yards in each of his last 2 games, even though he only has 4 receptions in both of those games. And Luther Burden, still in the concussion protocol. We'll see if he gets cleared for this week. Believe it or not, the Miami Dolphins are currently allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But there's a catch here. They have also faced the 7th fewest passing attempts in the NFL. Of the bottom 7 teams, Miami is the only one that hasn't had their bye yet. So they actually, with no bye, are at the very bottom of the list of passing attempts. That just means teams are not throwing the ball against Miami because they're having so much positive game script and they're having success running the football. Khalil Shakir is really the only wide receiver for Buffalo right now that I would consider playing. He is a fringe start at best with a wide range of outcomes. Could he have like a mid to high wide receiver 2 performance? Absolutely. But he also could be more like a wide receiver 4. He's the most consistent option for Buffalo though right now, is Keon Coleman has not sniffed being fantasy viable in weeks. He had a great week 1 and he's completely disappeared since then. When Miami and Buffalo faced off earlier in the season, they had Tyreek Hill, but Jalen Waddle was able to find the end zone. But if you take out a rain-soaked, windy game against Cleveland a couple of weeks ago, Jalen Waddle, since the Tyreek Hill injury, has been on fire. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 110 yards. 8 targets, 6 receptions, 95. 6, 5, 99, 9, 6, 82. This guy has actually been a true wide receiver 1 potential player every single week since Tyreek Hill went down with his injury. And I had some major concerns at that point in time whether Tua was going to be good enough to actually get Jalen Waddle the ball that often. And hey, for as bad as Tua has been at sometimes, if you own Jalen Waddle, you do not care. The Baltimore wide receivers, it's fun to think about what they could do with Lamar Jackson, but then you look at what they've actually done and it just doesn't get you excited to play them on a weekly basis. And this week going up against Minnesota, who just played Detroit very, very tough with their defense and allows the 8th fewest fantasy points per games to opposing wide receivers, this is not going to be an easy matchup for them. Hopkins and Bateman were off them at this point. Bateman has touchdown potential every single week, but very rarely will cash in on that. And for Zay Flowers, he has a solid amount of targets this week. He is a guy that has wide receiver 2 potential each week based on the targets alone, but he's only been inside the top 24 1 time this season. Justin Jefferson with a solid week last week. He caught 6 of his 9 targets, only for 47 yards, but he did score a touchdown. And he hasn't quite had the ceiling with J.J. McCarthy that we've experienced with Justin Jefferson in the past, but that doesn't mean that he won't find it at some point this season. And he continues to be a must start, especially in a matchup against Baltimore, who's still allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They've gotten a little bit healthier on defense, and they've done better against the run, but they still are struggling against the pass. Jefferson, obviously going to be playing him. Jordan Addison, if he can get more than 5 targets per game, he's definitely a much easier start. But if we're seeing that low end of targets, then we've got a guy that is very touchdown or big play dependent. Cleveland this week is going up against that same New York Jets team that we just discussed a few minutes ago that traded their number 1 quarterback, Sauce Gardner. So that could end up making things a little bit more interesting this week. But even based on what I've seen from the wide receivers in Cleveland so far this season, I mean, you could throw out a couple of fifth graders at cornerback, and I'm still more than likely going to pass on any of these guys. Cedric Tillman is expected to come off the IR and be ready to make his return this week. So I am going to give him a sit designation right now, even though I've got an X up there for his injury in case there's any setbacks or anything like that. Like I mentioned, this matchup might be a little bit easier right now, but for me personally, because I haven't seen anything with these guys consistently, I would rather take dart throws with guys that I listed at the beginning of the video, like the Indianapolis wide receivers, Alec Pierce and Josh Downs. I'd much rather go with them. I'd much rather give Darius Slayton a shot this week. And newly acquired Adonai Mitchell will probably see some time on the field this weekend, but I don't expect it to be a ton. Once again, shorter week because he was traded on Tuesday, getting into the building on Wednesday, learning the playbook Wednesday into Thursday, trying to turn that around on Sunday is going to be tough. Going up against a Cleveland defense also will be tough, and I don't think we're for sure who the starting quarterback is even going to be at this point. The one thing I do know is Garrett Wilson. If he can play, then he absolutely would be a start because no matter who's been at quarterback this season, he's getting plenty of volume. New England and Tampa Bay are going to have a couple of wide receivers that we have to keep an eye on throughout the week. The first one being Kayshon Boutte, who's currently dealing with a hamstring injury. And if he's not able to go this week, that's good news for Stefon Diggs. Not great numbers last week, 38 receiving yards, only 4 targets. He did catch a touchdown. But no, Boutte is one less player that he has to compete with for targets. And Drake May has been looking to Boutte quite a bit here as of recent. So Diggs could really have himself a day. A little bit more volume, and I like his touchdown potential as well. But if Boutte doesn't end up playing, people are going to ask about Matt Collins or Demario Douglas. And Demario Douglas had 100 receiving yards last week, 6 targets, and a touchdown. He's going to be like a bottom of the barrel emergency option. If for some reason Boutte can't go this week and you're dealing with injuries, buys, you've got guys that you can't play this week, whatever it may be, if you're just looking for some hope, then Demario Douglas may be a guy we look at if Boutte can't play. And for Tampa Bay, it's going to be about Chris Godwin. When will he be ready to return and how healthy will he be considering he's already had a setback so far this season? And Emeka Egbuka, he's obviously a start no matter what. He continues to be a great play every single week. Him and Baker Mayfield are on the same page. Tez Johnson, he's going to be a fringe start for me. Tez has at least 4 receptions in 3 of his last 4 games, and at least 40 receiving yards in all 4 games, and has included 2 touchdowns during that span. So he's been a solid fill-in, while Chris Godwin has been injured, and unfortunately, Mike Evans has been out. New Orleans is going to get a Carolina defense coming off of a big game against Green Bay last week, so I'm not loving New Orleans offense this week. Losing Rashid Shaheed is going to be interesting. He was kind of that deep threat, that big play guy that could extend the field. Does Brandon Cooks take over? Devon Bell is the guy that I'm keeping my eye on, but Bell is more of a slot receiver for me, not a big-time playmaker. Chris Olave has seen so many targets this season, he's going to stay as a fringe start. Even going up against Carolina, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game, he's going to be a flex option. And with no Rashid Shaheed anymore to take away some of those targets, Chris Olave will probably end up being flooded with targets for at least the next few weeks as Brandon Cooks and Devon Bell kind of step into new roles. I wouldn't pick him up as of yet, but Devon Bell is the guy that I would keep in mind if you're looking for somebody to potentially take over some of the targets that Shaheed was seeing. People love Tet McMillan, and he's one of those guys that has been getting a ton of targets. But realistically, we should probably be looking at Tet McMillan more along the lines of Chris Olave. And even Chris Olave has had more upside than him this season. At times this year, Olave has had a ton of targets, but really hasn't showcased a ton of fantasy output with them. Tet McMillan is basically the same way. A ton of targets, not a lot of fantasy production. Olave has had more upside at times, though, and McMillan really has only shown upside one time this year. Because of that, really for me at this point, he's barely a fringe start. If you still feel like you need to roll him out on a consistent basis, I get it. But I think we need to stop looking for the ceiling, and we just need to play him for his floor more often. We have so many wide receivers listed for Jacksonville right now. Brian Thomas Jr. is dealing with an ankle injury. Could potentially play this week. No word for sure yet. Travis Hunter just went to IR. Diami Brown dealing with a concussion. Parker Washington, solid week last week, a guy that we definitely would have looked at this week. Jacksonville just decided to trade for Jakobi Meyers. Now he's on the list as well. And I don't think Jakobi Meyers is going to come into Jacksonville and set the world on fire and be a must-play fantasy guy the rest of the season. He definitely hurts Parker Washington and what he could potentially do. Although for this week, going up against Houston, allowing the second fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, I don't feel the need to have to play Parker Washington anymore. Again, there are some guys that I would consider over him as emergency options, and I'll name them again. You've got Downs and Pierce from Indianapolis that you could end up playing. You've got Darius Slayton that you could end up playing. And this is one of those instances where if there's no Kayshon Boutte, I would argue potentially doing Demario Douglas over Parker Washington or Jakobi Meyers instead. And there's also 48 wide receivers that we need to have on the slide for Houston. Over 100 wide receivers we have to talk about in this matchup. And when you take a look at it, it's Nico Collins. Like, he's the guy. 11 targets last week, will still be the number one, regardless of who plays at quarterback this week, whether it be CJ Stroud, if he clears concussion protocol, or whether it be Davis Mills. And the thing for me when I look at Kirk and Hutchinson and Noel and Higgins, and there's no reason to play any of those guys right now, especially if it's Davis Mills. I'll go with Nico Collins if it's with Davis Mills. I will not go with these other guys if it's Davis Mills. Arizona and Seattle will meet this week for a divisional face-off, but it's not just this game that makes it a must-watch. It's the wide receivers, and that's why it's going to be my underdog must-watch matchup of the week at the wide receiver position. Marvin Harrison Jr. has been playing way better with Jacoby Brissett since he took over at quarterback. And for right now, it looks like Brissett is going to be the quarterback moving forward. And then not only do you have JSN and his big playmaking ability on the other side, the wide receiver one in my opinion for the rest of the season, but they also have Rashid Shaheed in tow now. And what is that going to mean for them moving forward? And I bet that you can find some great plays here at the wide receiver position to toss into a ticket for pick'ems over on Underdog. And we're talking about pick'ems all week long, whether it be in Discord, whether it be Jake's video on Fridays. Heck, we're even killing it with NBA pick'ems right now. We are absolutely hot, and all of our members in Discord are seeing green waves on their Underdog tickets. But the only way that you can join us is by downloading the Underdog app, signing up using code HEADLINERS, and making a deposit of at least $10. Not only are you going to get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit that you can pair with anything that we talk about throughout the week, but also you're going to get up to $100 in bonus bets when you play your $10. So download the Underdog app and start seeing green waves like the rest of our members. It's not the best matchup in the world. Seattle is still allowing the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and that defense under Mike Macdonald is playing extremely well. He's a great defensive mind, and we saw it during his time at Michigan. Not shocked that he got a head coaching gig. When you take a look at what Marvin Harrison Jr. has done, coming off the wide receiver 6 performance last week against a poor Dallas defense, I don't expect him to do the same thing, but him and Jacoby Brissett are clearly on a different level that him and Kyler Murray were not. And if you want a dart throw for 40 yards, it's Michael Wilson for me. He has been over 40 receiving yards in each of his last 3 games with Jacoby Brissett. Again, a tougher matchup, and not one that I think either one of these guys has a high ceiling in, but if Michael Wilson can have 4 catches for 40 yards and give you 8 points in a PPR league, it may not be the worst dart throw of the week. Honestly, for JSN, this isn't even fair to opposing defenses. Adding Rashid Shaheed is going to create a new element to this defense that's going to make JSN even tougher to cover. Now, here's one thing about Rashid Shaheed. Clint Kubiak, the offensive coordinator in Seattle, used to be the offensive coordinator for Rashid Shaheed. And when one of your previous offensive coordinators makes a trade for you, you clearly are coming into town to do something. What you could do in Seattle now is put Rashid Shaheed and Torrey Horton on the outside and Jackson Smith-Njigba back in at the slot. Neither of these guys are going to take away volume from JSN, but the big playability and the mismatches from the slot are going to make JSN even more dangerous than he already is. And at this point, I'll be honest, I would not be shocked if he makes a run at the most receiving yards ever in a season, because at this point, nobody has slowed him down, and the extra element of two deep playmakers on either side are going to open him up even more for big play opportunity, and he's not going to lose any volume. Torrey Horton takes a huge hit here because Rashid Shaheed plays a very similar deep threat role. Shaheed is one of those guys that could walk in and make an impact right away because he's coming back into an offense that he already knows and he's already familiar with. I don't think either of these guys have a ton of potential this week, and we might want to keep an eye on them to see how they do play out over the next couple of weeks here, but one of them could have a big play touchdown at any point in time. For the LA Rams in San Francisco, we're keeping an eye on Puka Nacua. He's beat up for the second time this season, and unfortunately, he is a wide receiver that continues to deal with the injury bug over and over and over. And clearly, if he plays, he is a start. Davante Adams, he's a start as well. He's such a good red zone threat right now that he's got touchdown potential every single week. If Puka Nacua were to miss for some reason, Davante Adams becomes a must-start top 12 potential player. The big X factor for the San Francisco 49ers right now has to be Ricky Pearsall and when he ends up returning. He's missed quite a bit of time, and I don't think anybody really knows exactly when he's going to return. And I don't feel like San Francisco is really giving us a whole lot of indication on how healthy he currently is and what his timetable for return would be. And with no Ricky Pearsall, Jauan Jennings and Kendrick Bourne will both carry some value. Bourne has a solid floor with a very low ceiling with Jauan Jennings being healthy. Jauan Jennings has touchdown potential every single week, but I don't know if his floor is as good as Kendrick Bourne. George Kittle being back also kind of hampers the ceiling that either of these guys would have. The Lions are looking to bounce back, not just from their loss last week against Minnesota, but that loss in the playoffs last year at home. And you can bet Detroit has their eyes set on doing the same thing to Washington, who now does not have Jaden Daniels. And the Washington defense isn't nearly as tough as it was at times last season. They are allowing the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. So Amon-Ra St. Brown, he's a start no matter what, one of the most consistent wide receivers in all of fantasy football right now. Jameson Williams, it was good to see a little life out of him last week. Scored a touchdown, and going up against Washington, he had a big play against them last year in the playoffs. I could see another big play again this year. He will be a fringe start for me after having to list him as a sit for the last couple of weeks. Detroit's secondary is getting a little bit healthier, and they're getting closer to having more people back, but they're still allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And the fact that they didn't make any deals at the deadline absolutely blows my mind. But that's a different time, different story. No Terry McLaurin. It sounds like it's going to be after week 12 before he could potentially return. He's going to be out for a while. With no Terry McLaurin, Deebo Samuel is a fringe start. If Jaden Daniels was the quarterback, he would be a start no matter what for me. But with Marcus Mariota at quarterback, even with a softer matchup on defense, I am worried about the pass rush for Detroit, making things difficult on Mariota. He could use that to dump off to Deebo a little bit more often, but Detroit, for the most part, does a good job of limiting those plays that are like dump offs to the running backs, wide receivers. DK Metcalf has been one of the bigger roller coasters at the wide receiver position so far this season. Over the course of his last 6 games, he has 3 top 12 performances. But those other 3 games, he was outside the top 30. So you're either getting a wide receiver 1 or you're getting a very low-end wide receiver 3. In this matchup, going up against the Chargers, currently allowing the 6th fewest fantasy points per game, I do think the ceiling is a little bit lower. But against Minnesota earlier in the year, he had a huge first half against a defense that is very comparable to what they do. Calvin Austin, he's kind of a fringe play for me. He's got a decent floor, not a super high ceiling. If you're looking for 6 targets, 4 receptions, 40 to 60 receiving yards, Calvin Austin is probably your guy. DK Metcalf, more touchdown potential. Calvin Austin, a little bit better floor. Pittsburgh is allowing the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers, though, and Ladd McConkey is a start for me. He has been the most stable wide receiver over the last few weeks for the Los Angeles Chargers. He's had at least 7 targets in every game since week 5, with 2 wide receiver 1 performances and 2 wide receiver 2 performances during that time. Quentin Johnston, very touchdown dependent, but he seems to be the number 2 guy right now behind Ladd McConkey at wide receiver. And then it's a mixture of McConkey, Johnston, and Gadsden as the top 3 targets currently for Justin Herbert. Keenan Allen, he is not on the field unless it's a 3 wide receiver set. So while I still think that he can make his fantasy floor in that type of situation, making him a fringe start, I think he's way more volatile than what some of these other guys may be. A.J. Brown missed prior to the bye week, but he is expected back for this game. Devontae Smith, if there's no A.J. Brown, he ends up being very risky. And on Monday Night Football going up against the Green Bay Packers, you can expect to potentially see a little bit of fireworks out of the wide receivers, whether that's with their gameplay or any type of altercation. I think both of these guys are going to have some of the widest range of outcomes that you're going to find at the wide receiver position. Both of them have a potential to be a top 3 wide receiver. Both of them also have the potential to be outside the top 36. Matthew Golden and Dontavian Wicks are both going to be questionable this week. Jaden Reed is still on the IR, and that at this point leads Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson. And since Tucker Kraft went down with an ACL injury, you have to expect that Doubs and Watson are probably going to be the 2 main pass catchers moving forward right now. Watson, way more ceiling, lower floor than Doubs, but way higher big play potential. Doubs, more touchdown potential, and a much better floor for me. Headliner Nation, that's going to do it for my start and sit analysis at the wide receiver position this week. We've had some trades, we have a ton of injuries, and we're looking for some dart throws and some guys that maybe you could use in an emergency situation. And hopefully this video gave you a couple of ideas that you could potentially use if you're dealing with any of those problems as well. I've got other start and sit videos I need to do now. I got to go get quarterbacks done. Hit the like button, subscribe, bell notification, hype the video, all the good things that help our videos become more visible on YouTube. But for now, Headliner Nation, stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.